You might recognize this book. It could have been on the back of your toilet. That's where it was for many folks over the years. If you're not familiar, Ask a Pro was a magazine column I did for Velo News magazine back in the day, and then when I stopped writing for them when I retired, it was collected into this book. Without getting too into the weeds on the publishing business, it was published by Velo Press, which was sold a couple times, is now out of print. They gave the rights back to me. My first thought was to redo it, was to come out with a new edition and update all the answers. I went through it. Some of them were really good, some of it was fun, and a lot of it just didn't age well, didn't really apply today. So to be honest, I took a few months of writing and just put it right in the trash. Instead, I decided to release sort of the highlights, some updates, some parts that were still applicable, some new questions. If you have new questions for Ask a Retired Pro, leave those in the comments. But I thought I'd re-release them as sort of a video podcast form. I could interview experts for each one. So the good news is for you, it's free. The bad news is you can't put this on the back of your toilet, sorry. I thought I'd start this with a question that I get a lot all year, but especially this time of year, that I've had conversations on recently and was definitely asked a lot in this book: how to go pro. Now that's changed a lot since I did it. So today we're going to talk to an expert. His name's Pat Lemieux. Pat works for the Human Powered Health women's team, does sponsorships for them. He's also an agent for a number of high-level endurance athletes. He's husband to gold medalist Gwen Jorgensen, so we learned a few things from that. Also, he's a great guy, a close friend of mine, and has been a big help in me putting together sponsorships and figuring out what I do for Worst Retirement Ever. So we'll get into how to get on a pro team, how to contact pro teams, what they look for in your results, your social media, stuff like that, what it might be like to be on those teams, what you might actually get paid or not get paid. Should you keep trying? Should you quit? Should you move to Belgium? We'll get into it for men and women. This episode is brought to you by Beam Dream. This is the cinnamon cocoa flavor. I haven't tried the new golden milk latte yet. And right now, through the whole month of November, everything on their site is 50% off. It's kind of a before bed hot cocoa, mix it with milk or water. It's clinically shown to improve your sleep. I've got the Whoop tracker. It makes my sleep a little bit longer, but actually noticeably longer in the REM sleep and improves the quality of my sleep. So I'll wake up less tired, less likely to hit the coffee first thing in the morning, more refreshed, more energized for the day. Maybe you're traveling this time of year, maybe you're going to visit some folks for the holidays. If you're changing time zones, you want to hit melatonin at the time of sunset, not before bed. People take it as a sleep aid. It's more to trigger your brain to produce sleep chemicals. I'm not getting into the science of it. I don't know how it works, but you want to take melatonin around sunset, and there is melatonin in the Beam Dream. All right, that's it for the sponsors. Watch that do better than the book royalties ever would have paid me. Publishing's brutal. All right, let's talk to Pat. All right, thanks, Pat, for joining us. Today, I thought we would talk about what's the path to going pro. And when I'm talking about pro now, I'm talking about World Tour, Road, the UCI, that specific niche of pro. We'll get into the privateer aspect later.
Thanks, Phil. I think the biggest thing that's really changed, right, since you and I were racing pro together 10, 11 years ago, is that the number of races that are available in the U.S., we all know, has drastically dropped off, right? There's right. Not a high level of pro caliber races that are available like there were 10, 12 years ago. So right now it's even more challenging because the issue is that European teams, they don't have a great understanding of the races that do exist here in the States and understanding if an athlete wins one of those in the US, how do they stack up in Europe? So what's even more critical, in my opinion, now are actually the race days that a US-based athlete is getting and will have access to in Europe. And the sooner they can start that, ultimately, the better. And a European-based team will say, hey, look, we know that they did 40 days as a 17-year-old, 47 days as an 18-year-old, and these are how they stacked up against athletes that we can really compare them to. So they're trying to make the most apples to apples comparison possible.
So over there they have there's a pretty clear path of here's a team you're on as a junior, here's the races you're doing the U23 Paris-Roubaix, whatever. Back in our day, to sound old, I used to compare racing in the US and North America to playing basketball, like say in Greece or Spain, where the best guy they could tell would translate just fine over here. He wouldn't necessarily go right to the top, but that was kind of a pathway. And then we'd have like here's your Gilas, your Redlands, and people would keep an eye on like, oh, these are the guys who are winning those. And then Tour of California, Tour of Utah, the Euros come over, you get a chance to show them in person. All of that is gone right now. So even looking at, I thought it'd be useful to look at like some of the Americans who've made it to the World Tour and sort of try to backtrack what their path is, and even how that's changed in the last few years. So, for example, the national team is the most standard path, right? So it was like national team combined with the action team that Axel Merckx runs. So that's your Lawson Craddock, Nilson Powless, Sean Quinn, um, Kevin Vermark, I believe, was also on that path. Is that right? National team for
Yeah, that
sure. I'm not
sounds.
sure. I
Yep.
forget if he
Yeah,
was
I
on
thought he
action
would.
or not.
That sounds right
But
to me.
all these guys were like on the World Tour radar from the age of 18. So that's, action, the national team, they're doing these talent ID camps from like age 15. I think you could sign up for those. And that's sort of you pay them and they allow you to like do this camp. There's some coaching, there's like a time trial, and they look at those results and say like, okay, and you, we bring you to Belgium to do, these races. And that's kind of the first step, right? Um, and then from there, these guys will do, they have Action had a North American program for a long time. Now they would just be Europe. Um, Matteo Jorgensen was the only exception. I don't believe he was on Action. Action somehow they didn't like him. Not sure why. And he ended up doing a couple years on Jelly Belly, which respect. That's a rite of passage for my generation. Everybody World Tour had to do 1 year on the belly, we'd call it. He did a year on Jelly Belly, but still always in the thing, and went. I don't think he had any insane results on Jelly Belly in North America, but they still kept an eye on him. He leaps right over to Movistar and pretty quickly shows that he belongs there as well. An interesting exception is this guy you might have heard of recently named Sepp. So let's talk about Sepp's path. Mountain biker as a junior, national champion, I believe, right? Went to college. So that was one of the things that like my generation is like, oh, our parents told us to go to college and darn it, we did. So me and Chad Haga and Joey Roscoff, who else? Keel, like a lot of that kind of squad. We had no other option, so we all went to college, and you feel like you're supposed to as an American. Turns out to kind of waste 4 years compared to the Sean Quinns and the Palaces and the guys who are doing Europe. So Sepp went to college and then was racing mountain bikes, switched to road sometime during college, I guess, right? Or he experimented. A lot of experimentation happens in college.
And Sepp ultimately was on a domestic elite team, right? An amateur team, based out of St. Louis.
Harley Davidson, right?
Yeah. And, had a massive result. It was at Redlands, I believe. And then ultimately got picked up by
Oak Glen.
And then got picked up mid-season by what must have been Optum or Rally at the time. And
right.
spent I think just the rest of the season there, and then got shuttled along straight to the World Tour.
Yeah, so they went from like an American team to a Pro Conti team, and sink or swim, and he swam okay. It's funny because like someone asked me a couple of weeks ago, like, oh, like Bill Sepp went to college and he raced in the U.S. and maybe that's a path I can follow, and that's sort of the context that I'm looking at all this podcast from. So let's investigate that path a little bit more. Does that Gateway? There were two Harley Davidson teams. I think it was Gateway, Harley Davidson. Does that team still exist? Probably, but whatever races they're doing, like is Redlands on the radar of any professional continental teams? The answer is no.
No,
I don't think
no.
The guy who won Redlands last couple of years, like super solid, but I don't think he's been able to like kind of bang on any doors across the pond. And then the Optum, the team that Sepp went to after he had that kind of breakout result, no longer has a men's team. So like that path, it sort of seems like, oh, it's gone. It's not like that anymore. So I don't know what Sepp would do today other than switch earlier.
Yeah, and I think the issue is again, I don't want to date ourselves here, but back in our racing era, there were a bunch of well-funded $50,000 to $100,000 amateur teams that a huge pool of riders could go on. And ultimately then that fed into, roughly at the peak, there were 13 based UCI continental teams, I think in 2008. And so you figure each one of those teams had 12 riders. So allowed for roughly 150 US domestic based professionals. And then from there, there'd be another squeeze. And that was, this was a period where Pro Continental seemed a little more relevant, tier 2. And then there was another further I would say, step up to World Tour. It seems that now, my impression is you need to be performing as a junior to get on to one of, the 2 or 3 U23 teams that exist, whether it's Action, whether it's Michael Creed's team, Avolo, and then ultimately that's your path, or the national team. And that's your pathway to get, we'll call it those 40 to 60 race days in Europe to really immerse yourself, and then to give an apples to apples comparison to, what will ultimately be the directors. But it's it's showing to be so that, most athletes seem to, especially from the US, they want to make the jump to World Tour as soon as possible. So they're racing U23, and then they are performing in a way that gets them to U23. And I think, again, Phil, much different than what was in our day was the prevalence of power meters, and these teams doing an audit on your training peaks to understand and learn your capacity, to see how much work you've done as a 19 to 23-year-old and what your numbers are, and then where they think the ceiling could be based on that audit.
So it's sort of good news and bad news, because I feel like my era, or our generation, there was this path of, you get your Cat 5, your 4, your 3, or 2, and it kind of goes all the way up to World Tour. And that was a pretend path. That was one of those, like, oh, you look at it and you think like, oh, that's a tier, it's right there. And then I look back at those years, and there's like 3 of us did it. Like everyone else came it was you're there at 22 or you're not. So it's discouraging if you're 22 and you're just getting started. But on the other hand, I can make it a lot easier for you to not like waste your entire 20s like many of our generation did, chasing something that was really never going to be there, or was just super limited. So a good example that sort of kills my point here is Riley Sheehan, which he's 23 years old, racing age 23 in 2023. Riley was on the Denver Disruptors, which is, I would say, it's a crit team that I would say is really not relevant to the European teams. They're not looking at criterium results in the U.S. for their roster. Obviously, he had something. So I actually spoke to him. I asked him for this podcast. I asked him, like, hey, what was your route? So for folks not paying super close attention like Pat and I, he recently won Perry Tours as a guest rider for the Israel team. So there's two tiers there. One of, how did you get to be a stagiaire for a World Tour team? Because that's super competitive with the results from the Denver Disruptors, with an American calendar. And then 2, winning Perry Tours. So what he said was, and this will speak to, this is right in Pat's soul. The answer is about winning. And it's not about like who helps, connections help. It's easy to be like, oh, that guy's father was a pro, whatever. Oh, that guy knew so and so, and it's like, connections matter, but the connections come when you win. And no one helps you if you're not worth it. No one can help you. Nobody wants to help you if you're going to make them look stupid. So yes, he had connections, and then he earned those connections, which is Reed helped him out. But he also did something completely undeniable, which is winning Perry Tours. So anyone who wants, like, you could dismiss the like, oh, how do you get that spot? Oh, he was incredibly good and deserved it. So that's kind of the answer too, is if you win everything available to you, if you go out there and you do just smash it left and right, and you do good numbers and you do your work. I'm not going to say I know what the path is, but you can bang your way through a path. Does that feel right, Pat?
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that we talk about all the time, right, is, there's 4 scales of races in the US, in Europe, 0.2, 0.1, point pro, and then a World Tour race. And so often we see these athletes win a 0.2 race and they get dismissed, and they say, oh, well, it's just a 0.2 UCI race, it doesn't matter. And Phil, you and I always say, all you can do is win the races that you're in, right? And so if you're getting these opportunities and they're in Europe and they might not be the most prestigious race, they're not Perry Tours, but you're winning races that are available, absolutely directors are looking at those and taking note, and they're saying, wow, that's an impressive result. I know, such and such did this race 4 years ago, and then this is the pathway they went on to. So there's a comparison, and it promotes thoughts that are, going on, and they can go, okay, well, look, this is how we're going to think about this athlete if they're performing at this race.
So say you have some of those results. Say you are Riley Sheehan, or you're someone like, this very small pool of dudes, but you're good enough. Say you're in the pool of dudes who are good enough. How do you advocate for yourself? Who do you contact?
Again, Phil, this is what's changed during
I know.
holy smoke. So, it's so simple now. You would go on to every single team website. You would say they've all got their staff listed. You would look at every single director that's on there. You would then pull up Instagram, and then you would start hitting the DMs that way. So back in the day when you and I were racing, Phil, we'd go to the UCI website. We'd look at the teams, and then we'd see there was a info@jellybelly.com. info at colavita.com. And that was
every continental team.
And they all have that. But now you can go one step deeper, and you can be, in the DMs of these directors and saying, and being relentless and saying, hey, look, this is, what do I got to do to impress you? How do I get your interest? How could I be on this team? Here's what I'm working on. This happens in my world all the time when I'm trying to reach out to brands, right? And I would just simply, you just can't give up, right? One email is not enough. You've got to demonstrate outside of the field of play racing that you're ready to work for this and you're committed. So that's one reality. If you're, someone like Riley Sheehan and you pull a big result at Perry Tours, the tables really turn. And now all of a sudden,
it's a lot easier.
It becomes much
easier. That boy had literally one shot. He just nailed it.
Yeah,
it's fantastic. I think the persistence and the patience is brutal. I hate patience, but it's key. I could go through my sent emails across various email platforms I've had since I was 22. I was emailing Jonathan Vaughters for 7 years before he hired me. I'm not even joking. It was the Univest Grand Prix when I was 21. I did well, and someone sent me a clip later of him on TV saying, who's that guy? I got to sign him. I emailed him the next day and no response. And 6 years later, I'm on that roster, a very hard-earned UCI minimum salary there. And then how is it different for women looking to the World Tour? What's the pathway there?
Sure. So this is something that I've just got a little bit closer look under the hood on, just because of my work that I'm doing with Human Powered Health Women's World Tour team. And the growth of women's cycling is absolutely amazing. And it's insane, how creative teams are getting now to search and identify talent. So the example I'll give is I've got an athlete who signed for what is now Lidl Trek, based on her ability to time trial. She had never done a road race before, but Trek had, again, we'll talk about doing an audit on her training peaks and her power files, and understood that there was a large ceiling there, and took a gamble and took a flyer. So right now,
she's a very accomplished triathlete, correct?
Correct. Yep. A young woman by the name of Taylor Knibb.
They're not looking at Strava yet.
Well, no, it's funny you say that, Phil. What my team had looked at her from her Strava KOMs in Boulder here. So that was one pathway that they used to identify. So no, I would say that they're being incredibly creative and looking in, I would say, non-traditional places to find and identify, and then ultimately nurture that talent along. So, since Tour de France Femmes has started, the growth has gone crazy. Salaries have gone through the roof, and it's a fantastic time to be in professional women's cycling. So, and that will continue. But I would say the standard pathways exist, right? Simply winning races is the number one way to be identified, but ultimately there are these other pathways, and the same thing is true if you're trying to get on one of these teams. It's not giving up until you hear a yes or a no. So people all the time get discouraged from no's. Typically, I love a no because it gives me clarity on what their decision is. Right. So I don't get discouraged.
I'll take 100 no's over a ghost. The ghost is the norm now.
The ghost is the norm. And so, I'll say that. I'll say, look, if it's a no, no issues. Give me but just give me that clarity, please. And so I think, yeah, what we're seeing, you look at a woman like Corinne Lebecki, who's, I would say she's been doing this sport forever, but she was clearly successful as a, multi, 40-time junior national champion. So that's an
Yeah.
easy one to talent ID and then bring up through the ranks. We look at Megan Jastrab, same thing, junior world champion, and
Yeah, they were
ultimately,
clearly on the path from age 13 plus.
yeah. So you'll see these athletes, especially on the women's side, taken from great junior results, and then they go straight to the world tour, because what does the world tour want to do? They want to scoop up these athletes on what seems like a great contract at the time, could be, anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000, and then hopefully make great value on that when the athlete performs later on.
This is the thing, is like I don't like popping people's dreams, but I also think it's good for them. And I look back at like the years that I had dreams that were completely ridiculous and unattainable. So I'm 19. I'm like, oh my God, Jelly Belly would be such a dream. And I work really hard and I get there and my salary is $2,000, not for the month, for the year. And it's just like, I wish I knew that. I wish I sort of knew what I was chasing. And I'm not to say I would have done anything different because it was in my soul, but uh, but I had no idea. And I wonder, like, so when you talk about the salaries being through the roof, can you put like a number to that? What's the minimum? How many people are on minimum? What are the top 10 looking at?
Sure. So I think the minimum UCI salary for a World Tour pro, that is not, they're not a stagiaire, they're not employed. So a lot of times what you have is, if you're
Mm-hmm.
on a European based team, it's an employed salary because the country is taking care of many of your health insurance costs that are baked in. So the self-employed minimum salary for a World Tour pro is 65,843 euros. The self-employed minimum wage currently for a women's World Tour pro is 52,647 euro. And I believe that the UCI intends to align those minimum salaries, and this is in conjunction with the CPA, that those plan to be aligned, I believe, in 2025. But we'll see. So I think that's the reality. And, there are the top 10 women in the world tour. They are making way more than the minimum salary, roughly between, I would say on the high end, it's 500, but at a minimum, it's 300.
Are there any women in seven figures? Would you guess?
I'm saying not yet. So the reality is
Yeah.
right now, and I spend very little time on Pro Cycling Stats, but the directors of these teams live on Pro Cycling Stats.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to Pro Cycling Stats, you can see the terms you can understand when an athlete's up for renewal. I believe right now, 18 of the top 20 UCI ranked women's World Tour riders are on contract until the end of 2024. That includes the top 3 from this year's Tour de France. I believe that come 2025, on that new contract year, one of those 3 will hit 7 figures.
For men, how many would we say are in seven figures? 15?
I was going to say 10 to 20. So you split the middle, you split the difference there. It's still shocking. I would say most people in general would be shocked at how many are on the minimum across the board on each team. So while the top has gone up, I would also say that there's a threshold that's stayed at the minimum.
I would say not quite half, but probably close to half, maybe in the like 40% are on the minimum allowable. And the reality is, like, because I was one of these, like, you're disposable. There's just it's a very hard job, and there's a lot of guys or girls who could do it. So if you're like, hey, I want 85 next year, then they're just going to find someone else who's been begging, that who's their inbox is full of people who are just as good as you, who are ready to take that spot, and they get to keep that $20,000 difference.
Yeah, and I want to, again, what's really changed the last 5 years in World Tour cycling specifically is the relegation system. So this began in 2020, and there was a 3-year accrual process of the points on the men's side. And now we just completed, yesterday was the last Women's World Tour race for the year in China. So there's now 15 teams that will be that will get their renewed licenses for another 2-year term. And what's become of more importance, right, are ultimately these individual UCI points that each rider gets that then demonstrate a value to the team. Because if a team loses their World Tour license, it's a big problem financially. So again, I don't want to date ourselves. But we can go back as recent as 2019. There were super domestiques, right, that they never had to get any sort of points in a race because their job was to just take care of the key riders. It could be in a one-day classic, could be in a Grand Tour. Now it's very challenging to establish a value on those and an importance on those riders, because ultimately the team it's so critical to understand and think about the points chase that will be going on. Now, if you're a top ranked team, Lotto Jumbo, Ineos, Quick Step, UAE, those teams naturally are going to get a ton of points because they're so GC focused. But if you look at the teams ranked from 15th to 20th, this is something that they are thinking about every single day.
And that's the thing where like the budget of those, it's invisible because all those teams, World Tour is World Tour, but the budget of the top teams is 40 million. The budget of the teams fighting for those last spots are in the 10 to 20s, closer to 20, but still half of what you're looking at. It's a big disadvantage of who they can afford to hire, essentially. When we talk about the minimum salaries, the continental teams, the smaller tier, so you're anything in North America at this point, what's the minimum salary on a UCI continental team, Patrick?
$0.
It is a goose egg. And many people are getting paid that goose egg. And I would say probably the majority of them are getting $0. So the ones who can win, but everyone else like, hey, you're lucky to be here. Because again, there's a long line of people and the money doesn't exist. The thing is, you can look at like, oh, these people are being exploited. And that can be said in a lot of different ways. Like, oh, you're making this guy work for free. And it's like, well, the money isn't there to pay them any differently, and it's a supply and demand situation. Like I was lucky to work for free for $2,000, and I remember like when I was finally winning Redlands and making 40, I'm like, there's a lot of guys who are almost as good as me making $0, and I've just got to be that much better than them to justify that difference. And that's the trick. But that's also, I think people should realize what they're looking at when they like look at a pro in the U.S. On the crit teams. There are folks making a salary from there's various different the crit squads now in the different leagues that do have, I'd say, a minimum that feels a lot for a bike racer, but it's really not that much for a teacher.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of folks making a livable wage if you're in your 20s and living somewhere reasonable and throwing some prize money.
And one final point I want to give to back that up, just so everyone has some understanding, because I think you'll hear my numbers earlier around the discrepancy between the men's World Tour minimum and the women's World Tour minimum. And those will close eventually. But the reality is that if you owned a cycling team, what you're governed to do by the UCI is you have to provide every contract that you receive on the team's behalf. The UCI has to look at those. And what is the UCI trying to achieve by that? They're not trying to be all controlling or all knowing, but ultimately what they need to see is the health of their business and the health of the sport that they represent, right? And that's how they make those decisions on how they're going to mandate the fees that the team is due to pay the riders, right? And so that's
right,
so they can't. They're making those decisions with some rationale based on the budgets they're seeing for those teams, right? And I think they
only care because it's how much they can squeeze you.
Yeah, I mean, we just right. So there's right. I mean, there's a registration fee, but I mean, and that may go up, but it's like it's a tiny part of the budget that the teams actually have, right? And so they're really trying to see where the money's coming from and how they can understand how it goes out to the riders.
I live in the U.S. and the question that I get all the time, and like a lot of the stuff that I was answering in Ask a Pro back in the day was,
uh, how to do it if you're from here, my audience. And I want to give the scale of then this is what I tell people in person, and I've had this conversation twice in the last few weeks. When I started, it was Health Net, Toyota United, and then below it. So there were teams, those were teams with $4 or $5 million budgets. Their top guys were maybe coming from Europe, making six figures easily. No one is seven, but like the guy who won Redlands was making six figures. There's 80 guys who paid a livable wage to fly to every NRC race. And that was down to 13 teams you mentioned before. So I just throwing out numbers, but I would say like the grand total being spent on American professional racing, if you look at the sponsors, the races, the teams,
in the US,
all the money available.
Then I would say, for sure, if we're throwing in events and thinking about the prize money, it was $20 or $30 million. Absolutely.
All the money available to be cut up among these 100 people.
Yeah.
And I would say now, if you look at the teams and the events, the same thing. I would say now it's maybe 10. I feel like it's maybe a third of that.
I mean, I would say even less. I mean, really if you think of all the events, right? So we know the NCL's got a $2 or $3 million budget, and we can put in the other criterium leagues that are probably doing it for less than $1 million, and the teams that represent it. So, the two big ones, right? When I think of the two US based professional teams, the only two that I think of are Legion and Project Echelon.
So I think about like how hard it was for me to exist those years, and what it looks to me like is it's just a lot harder now. And I feel like I barely squeak through. And anyone I see who's like, oh, I want to do what you do, and I'm just like, what I did isn't available. And I would have said the thing we can end this on like a hopeful note. The thing is, I would have told Riley Sheehan like, yo man, it's not possible. I would have said that to him 6 months ago, had he been dumb enough to ask me. I don't know him other than an Instagram that he was really polite to respond to the other day. All right. Does it help for folks to, like, a lot of people lean into like, oh, if I'm really good on social media, maybe that will help me get on a pro team. Does that work? Is that worth the effort?
What I always talk about ultimately is the North Star and what needs to be a North Star for an athlete. And for me and for most athletes that I see, it has to be performance, right? And another thing that I always say is success leaves clues. We can look at how most other professionals got onto professional teams. It wasn't through their social media value. It was through results.
I would agree with that. And as the social media person looking back, like I felt like it was a way to tell a story. It helped me now. It kind of gave me my afterlife for sure, but it didn't. Maybe it was a tiebreaker. If they're looking to hire an American, there's three of us who are just about as good as each other, and one of them has, a fan base and a blog and a good social media presence and sponsors are into it. That helped me through, but it doesn't leapfrog over someone who's going to finish 5 spots ahead of you.
One thing that we always look at and I talk about is like working your content muscles or working some social media muscles. And I think it's very important, and it provides a great point of difference that's, attractive. But ultimately, to get these athletes that are getting on what I call real pro teams, it's through real results.
And a counterpoint there is an Allison Jackson who has it all, who, like, I knew her as the TikTok person. Obviously she's on a pro team. I assume she's good. And then she wins Roubaix, and it's like, oh, she's actually that good. And she has all the other tools. Where does that land her? Does that make her a shit ton more money? Does that put her on TV commercials?
Ultimately, I think for her it's just a sponsor's dream, right? And then the sponsors get to activate it on the back end. And ultimately, I think it's clear that she signed with the EF women's team. That would have been a huge part of her re-signing. I can't speak to the fact that she got paid more because she obviously performed and she won Roubaix, but I think if you look at her UCI ranking, she's in the 20s or 30s. She got paid for that. And then this, I'll call them the stuff that the social media stuff is that's just the cherry on top. She happens to be fantastic at that. And every sponsor is going to be happy that they have her on the team's roster.
If you can really get results and you're that good at storytelling and you have people who are cheering for you, that's another tier. But it still, again, the results come first. So you can like flex the muscles, learn, like be comfortable telling a story, expressing yourself. But it's not about how many followers you have. That'll go from 0 to 1 million real quick. if you win Roubaix. Anything else, Pat? What did we miss?
Yeah, I think in closing, it's just really important that, reflecting on what I wish I would have done as a pro, and I wish I would have asked people that were much, much smarter than me, and I wish I would have leaned into and asked more questions. And so I would encourage everyone to be very curious and, just keep asking questions, right? Reach out to somebody like Phil, reach out to somebody like me who will know more than you, and just pick their brain as much as possible.
God bless me. I respond to DMs from desperate people who remind me of my past. I do, and so does Pat. We're out there. So next week, we're going to talk about privateering and professional skills and sort of the North American, the other pathways of different versions of pro and what all that means. So we will talk to you then. Thank you.